In the early 2000s, a woman carrying the blood of Queen Victoria was living on state benefits, filling out Social Security paperwork just to keep the lights on. Marina Ogilvy. Born 24th, in line to the throne, and raised in the velvet sanctuary of Thatched House Lodge in Richmond Park, she had traded a destiny of gilded untouchability for a life of financial struggle and state dependence, becoming the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when you dare to wage war against the House of Windsor. This is the brutal autopsy of a royal self-destruction, the story of a princess who swapped her tiara for black rubber fetish gear, sold her family's darkest secrets to the tabloids for cash, and accused her saintly mother of monstrous cruelty on national television, ultimately discovering that when you light a match to burn down the monarchy, you are the only one left standing in the ashes. She was not born into a fringe branch of the family, tolerated but ignored. She was born in 1966 at the height of the swinging 60s, into a household that was considered the gold standard of royal behavior. Her mother was Princess Alexandra, the Honorable Lady Ogilvy, a figure who for decades held a unique and revered place in the British consciousness. Alexandra was the Queen's first cousin and her closest confidant, a woman who possessed all the dignity of the monarch, but with a touch more approachability, a grace that seemed effortless rather than practiced. In the 1960s and 70s, when the royal family was still viewed with a reverence bordering on religious awe, Princess Alexandra was the saint of the institution. She was the one who never put a foot wrong, the one who performed thousands of dull, repetitive engagements with a genuine smile, the one who embodied the stiff upper lip without ever seeming cold. She was the heroine of the family, the dependable anchor in a changing world. Marina's father, Sir Angus Ogilvy, was the perfect complement to this royal perfection. The second son of the Earl of Airlie, he was a handsome, distinguished businessman who refused a peerage upon marriage because he wanted to make his own way, a gesture that only endeared him further to a public that valued humility. Together, Alexandra and Angus were the golden couple, the safe pair of hands. They lived in Thatched House Lodge in Richmond Park, a stunning grace and favor residence gifted by the Crown, surrounded by acres of manicured gardens and the silence of privilege. It was a world of ponies in the stables, nannies in starched uniforms, and Christmas parties at Windsor Castle, where the playmates were princes and future kings. On paper, it was paradise. It was a childhood scripted by the best PR agents of the aristocracy, a life of guaranteed comfort and prestige. But beneath the polished mahogany surface of this idyllic existence, a profound and dangerous silence was festering. The psychological architecture of Marina's childhood was built on the crushing weight of expectation. To be the daughter of a saint is a heavy burden for any child, but to be the daughter of a royal saint is a recipe for neurosis. From the moment she could walk, Marina was aware that she was being watched, not just by her parents, but by the firm itself. She was expected to be a miniature version of her mother, quiet, dutiful, smiling, and impeccably groomed. But nature, in a cruel twist of irony, had given Marina a personality that was the polar opposite of Alexandra's serenity. Marina was vibrant, loud, impulsive, and deeply messily emotional. She was a child who craved attention in a household where making a scene was the ultimate sin. While her brother, James, seemed to inherit the family's gene for discretion and calm, Marina was the live wire, the glitch in the algorithm. The nursery at Thatched House Lodge, while physically comfortable, was an emotional desert for a child of Marina's temperament. In the aristocratic tradition of the time, intimacy was often outsourced to staff. Nannies came and went, serving as the primary caregivers, while the parents were busy with the relentless schedule of royal duties. Princess Alexandra, for all her public warmth, was a woman of her generation and class, for whom duty always came first. The love was undoubtedly there, but it was a distant, formalized love, expressed through structure and discipline rather than emotional availability. Marina grew up feeling a profound disconnect, a sense that she was a disappointment simply by being herself. She was the difficult one, the child who wouldn't sit still, the child who asked too many questions, the child who didn't fit the mold. And in a family that values conformity above all else, to be different is to be dangerous. As she entered her school years, the cracks began to widen into chasms. She was sent to St. Mary's School, Wantage, an elite Anglican boarding school designed to churn out suitable wives for the aristocracy, girls who could organize a charity gala, manage a country estate, and support a husband's career with silent efficiency. But Marina chafed against the rigid discipline of the nuns and the stifling social expectations of her peers. She wasn't interested in being a suitable wife. She was interested in being seen. Reports from her youth hint at a girl who was constantly pushing boundaries, acting out in desperate bids for attention. There were whispers of tantrums, of conflicts with authority figures, of a simmering anger that no amount of etiquette lessons could suppress. She was a round peg being hammered violently into a square hole, and the pressure was building with every passing year. The 1980s arrived, bringing with them a seismic shift in the culture and the monarchy. This was the era of Lady Diana Spencer and Sarah Ferguson, the Sloane Ranger Revolution, where breathless young women in pie-crust collars were suddenly the center of the world's attention. But while Diana and Fergie were being courted by princes and celebrated by the press, Marina was drifting into a dangerous limbo. She was in her early 20s, the prime age for a high society marriage, but she had no interest in the parade of chinless wonders and banking heirs that were paraded before her. She lacked the ethereal, marketable charisma of Diana, and she lacked the hearty, resilient humor of Fergie. Marina was something else entirely. She was moody, artistic, and fundamentally lost. She drifted through a series of suitable courses, secretarial work, stage makeup, tropical survival, none of which stuck. She was searching for an identity that didn't involve a curtsy. She tried to carve out a life as a working woman, but she had no marketable skills and no understanding of how the real world functioned. She was a creature of the palace ecosystem, evolved to survive in a hothouse of privilege, now trying to breathe the thin air of the real world. This aimlessness was viewed by her parents not as a cry for help, but as a lack of discipline. The tension at Thatchet House Lodge grew toxic. The saint and the sinner were locked in a cold war of passive aggression. Alexandra, baffled by her daughter's inability to just be normal, retreated further into her shell of duty. Angus, the stern patriarch, grew increasingly frustrated with Marina's lack of direction. It is crucial to understand the isolation Marina felt during these years. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. She couldn't talk to the press, obviously. She couldn't complain to her friends, most of whom were part of the same incestuous social circle and would report back to their parents. She was trapped in a gilded cage where the door was unlocked, but she was too terrified and ill-equipped to fly away. She developed a profound resentment toward the system, the unspoken rules, the hypocrisy, the relentless demand for appearances. She saw the cracks in her parents' perfect facade, the separate lives, the emotional distance, and she hated them for it. She hated the falseness of it all. She wanted something real, something raw, something that would shatter the polite silence that had suffocated her for 2 decades. And then into this volatile atmosphere of repressed rage and vulnerability walked Paul Mowat. To the Ogilvys, Paul Mowat was not just an unsuitable suitor, he was a biological threat to the dynasty. He was a freelance photographer, a profession that, in the eyes of the old-school aristocracy, was only one step above a paparazzo or a thief. He was trade. He was street-smart, rugged, and completely unimpressed by titles. He didn't bow and scrape. He wore leather jackets. He spoke with an accent that wasn't cut glass. To Marina, starving for oxygen in her hermetically sealed world, Mowat must have felt like a hurricane. He was dangerous. He was exciting. He was the antithesis of everything her father stood for. He offered her the one thing she had never had, a mirror that didn't reflect a princess, but a woman. Their romance in 1989 was fast, furious, and chemically unstable. It was a rebellion disguised as a relationship. Marina threw herself into the affair with the reckless abandon of someone who has nothing left to lose. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She was dating a bad boy. She was defying her parents. She was breaking the rules. But Marina, in her naivety, did not understand the difference between a teenage rebellion and a life-altering catastrophe. She treated the relationship like a fling, unaware that she was playing with dynastic fire. She did not realize that the firm has a way of handling problems like Paul Mowat, usually by freezing them out until they disappear. But Mowat was not the type to disappear, and Marina was not the type to go quietly. The catastrophe, when it arrived, did not come with a bang, but with a biological fact. Marina Ogilvy, 23 years old, unmarried and 24th in line to the throne, missed a period. In 2024, a royal pregnancy out of wedlock might be navigated with a carefully worded Instagram post and a modern spin on partnerships. But in 1989, it was a nuclear event. The moral landscape of the monarchy was still Victorian in its rigidity. The Queen was the head of the Church of England. The shame of an illegitimate child was not just personal, it was institutional. It was a stain on the white gloves of the monarchy. When Marina discovered she was pregnant, the fear must have been paralyzing. She knew the rules. She knew the penalty for breaking them. But mixed with the fear was a strange, dark thrill. This was it. This was the bomb that would finally blow up the cage. She traveled to Thatched House Lodge to deliver the news to her parents, likely expecting a scene of dramatic confrontation. But what happened next would become the subject of one of the most vicious public disputes in royal history, a moment that would sever the bond between mother and daughter for decades and set Marina on a path of total self-destruction. The confrontation at Thatched House Lodge was the tipping point. According to the narrative Marina would later construct for the world, the reaction from the saintly Princess Alexandra was not one of maternal concern, but of icy, ruthless pragmatism. The mask of the benevolent royal slipped, revealing the steel machinery beneath. Marina claimed her parents offered her a brutal ultimatum, a choice so stark it sounds like something from a medieval chronicle rather than a 20th century family drama. They allegedly told her that the child was a disaster. They allegedly suggested or perhaps demanded an abortion. Failing that, she was to go away, hide the pregnancy, give the child up, and return only when she was purified. Whether these words were actually spoken with such Dickensian cruelty or whether they were the frantic interpretations of a terrified daughter matters less than the effect they had. Marina felt rejected on a cellular level. She felt that her parents loved the image of their family more than they loved her. She felt that to them she was not a daughter in crisis, but a public relations problem to be solved. And in that moment of absolute rejection, the sadness in Marina's heart curdled into a cold, hard hatred. The golden child was dead, the rebel was born, and she realized with a terrifying clarity that she possessed a weapon. She had the one thing the royal family feared more than revolution, more than republicanism, more than war. She had secrets, and for the first time in her life she was willing to sell them. This realization was the pivot point upon which her entire life would turn. As the heavy doors of her childhood home closed behind her, locking her out of the sanctuary she had known since birth, the sadness calcified into a cold, transactional resolve. She was no longer a daughter seeking comfort. She was an adversary seeking leverage. The private pain of the nursery was about to be dragged into the neon glare of the public square, and the silence that the royal family cherished above all else was about to be shattered by the one sound they could not control, the voice of a woman with nothing left to lose. The drive away from Thatched House Lodge that afternoon was not merely a physical departure, it was a psychological exile. As the wrought iron gates clicked shut behind her, Marina Ogilvy was no longer just a wayward daughter. She was a rogue state, a sovereign entity of rage operating outside the jurisdiction of family loyalty. The ultimatum she claimed her parents had delivered, to abort the child or face total ostracization, had created a vacuum in her soul where duty used to be. In that void, a terrifying new logic began to take root. If the House of Windsor was going to treat her like a stranger, she would treat them like a business opportunity. If they were going to starve her of affection, she would feast on their reputation. She realized, with the cold, crystalline clarity of the desperate, that while she possessed no money, no property, and no power in the traditional sense, she held the detonator to a bomb that could shatter the carefully curated stained glass of the monarchy. She had the story. In 1989, the ecosystem of the British press was a hungry, predatory beast, but it still operated under a fragile, unwritten truce with the palace. The tabloids would nip at the heels of the royals. They would speculate and gossip, but there was a line they rarely crossed: direct collaboration with a family member to destroy the others. The royals were supposed to be a united front, a phalanx of discretion. Marina decided to cross that line. She didn't just leak a rumor, she brokered a deal. She approached the Today newspaper, a tabloid known for its aggressive, checkbook journalism, and offered them the scoop of the decade. She was selling her parents. She was selling the Queen. She was selling the very concept of royal dignity. The reported fee was £30,000, a significant sum for a broke 23-year-old, but a pittance compared to the damage it would cause. It was the price of a soul, discounted for a quick sale. When the story broke in early October 1989, it hit the British establishment with the force of a physical blow. The headline was not a polite suggestion of family discord. It was a scream. "My royal parents cut me off. Marina, I'll be a pauper princess." The text was a visceral blow-by-blow account of the confrontation at Thatched House Lodge, stripped of all nuance and presented as a morality play where Marina was the innocent pregnant victim and Princess Alexandra, the nation's sweetheart, was the wicked stepmother. Marina detailed the alleged demands for an abortion, the cold threats of disinheritance, the suggestion that she had brought shame upon the family. She painted a picture of the Windsors, not as the benevolent guardians of tradition, but as a ruthless, icy mafia that cared more about protocol than the life of an unborn child. For the British public, this was cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. They were accustomed to seeing Princess Alexandra cutting ribbons at hospices, smiling benevolently at children, embodying the very essence of Christian charity. To hear her own daughter describe her as a monster who would demand the termination of a pregnancy to save face was a shock to the system. It shattered the illusion of the royal saint. It peeled back the velvet curtain and revealed the rusted, grinding gears of the machine. Marina had done the one thing a royal must never do. She had humanized them, but she had humanized them as villains. She had dragged the lofty ideals of the monarchy down into the gutter of a domestic dispute, forcing the public to view the Queen's cousins not as semi-divine figures, but as a dysfunctional family arguing about birth control and money. But if the words were damaging, the visuals were a massacre. To accompany the story, Marina participated in a photo shoot that remains to this day one of the most bizarre and subversive images in royal history. She did not pose in a demure cardigan, looking like a repentant mother-to-be. She did not sit in a garden surrounded by flowers. Instead, she chose a visual language that was a deliberate, violent mockery of her heritage. She posed in a black, skin-tight rubber jumpsuit, fetish gear essentially, surrounded by corgis, the iconic dog of the Queen. On her head, she wore a prop crown, jaunty and cheap. The symbolism of this image was intricate and devastating. The rubber was a nod to the underground, to the sexual, to the deviant world that the monarchy pretends does not exist. It was a rejection of the tweed and silk of her upbringing. The corgis were a direct visual link to the Queen, dragging the monarch into the tableau. And the crown was the punchline. By wearing a fake crown while dressed in fetish wear, she was saying that the real crown was just a prop too. She was saying that the pomp and circumstance of royalty was nothing more than a costume drama, a performance no more dignified than her dressing up in rubber. It was a desecration. It was punk rock. It was the visual equivalent of graffitiing the altar at Westminster Abbey. When the Queen reportedly saw the photographs, the reaction was not anger, but a profound, bewildered sadness. It was the behavior of a creature the palace simply did not have a classification for. It was vulgarity weaponized. Not content with the print media, Marina escalated her war to television. She appeared on Wogan, the BBC's flagship chat show, watched by millions. To sit on Terry Wogan's couch was usually the preserve of movie stars promoting blockbusters or singers plugging a new album. Marina was there to plug her own victimhood. The nation watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the cousin of the Queen sat under the studio lights, her face swollen with tears, and dismantled her family's reputation live on air. She wept. She trembled. She recounted the coldness of her parents, the letters from her father that she claimed were tricks to get her to comply. "I have been left without a penny," she sobbed, positioning herself as a Dickensian orphan cast out into the snow. "They said they would wash their hands of me." The performance was compelling, but it was also deeply uncomfortable. There was something grotesque about seeing a woman of such immense privilege complaining about poverty while sitting in a television studio. The audience was torn. On one hand, the cruelty she described, if true, was abhorrent. No parent should reject a pregnant child, but on the other hand, there was a sense of entitlement radiating from her complaints. She was effectively saying, "I want to break all the rules. I want to sleep with the photographer. I want to have the baby. But I also want the money, the house, and the approval." She wanted the revolution, but she wanted the palace to pay for it. She was exposing the fundamental paradox of the modern royal rebel, asserting independence while demanding support from the very institution you are attacking. The reaction from the palace was a masterclass in the weaponization of silence. The gray men, the private secretaries, the press officers, the fixers, went into lockdown. They knew that to engage with Marina was to give her oxygen. If they issued a denial, they were in a debate. If they attacked her, they looked like bullies. So they did nothing. They let her speak. They let her scream. They calculated with a ruthlessness that bordered on genius that if they gave her enough rope, she would eventually hang herself. They knew that the public's appetite for scandal is finite, and that pity eventually turns to distaste. They wagered that Marina's story, while explosive, lacked the stamina of the truth. They simply froze her out. The portcullis came down, the drawbridge was raised, and Marina was left outside, screaming at stone walls that refused to echo back. But the silence from the palace did not mean inactivity. Behind the scenes, the machinery was grinding. The family was humiliated, yes, but they were also mobilized. The sheer tackiness of her public rebellion had alienated the aristocratic support network that might have otherwise sided with Marina. Her friends, the debutantes, and the heirs she had grown up with recoiled. It was one thing to have a bastard child. That happened in the best of families. It was another thing entirely to sell the story to a rag like today. That was unforgivable. That was common. Marina found that her social circle evaporated overnight. She had the money from the interview. She had the attention of the public, but she had lost her tribe. She was now adrift in a no-man's land between the celebrity culture she courted and the royal culture she was born into, belonging to neither. Meanwhile, the relationship with Paul Mowat, the catalyst for this nuclear explosion, was shifting under the pressure. In the beginning, he was the dashing rescuer, the man who stood by her against the might of the establishment. But as the cameras flashed and the checks were cashed, the dynamic began to curdle. They were now partners in an enterprise of scandal. Their relationship was no longer just a romance, it was a business, and the product they were selling was grievance. They were trapped in a feedback loop where the only way to generate income was to generate more noise, more controversy, more conflict. They were the Bonnie and Clyde of the tabloid age, running on adrenaline and spite, speeding towards a cliff edge that everyone but them could see coming. As 1989 bled into 1990, the initial shock of the scandal began to fade, replaced by a grim curiosity about the endgame. Marina was heavily pregnant, living in chaos, and completely estranged from the support system she had known since birth. The baby was coming, and with the arrival of the child, the stakes would shift again. The firm cannot ignore a blood relative forever, especially an innocent infant. The question hanging over London was whether the birth of the baby would bring a reconciliation or whether the child would become another pawn in the war. Marina, emboldened by her media blitz but increasingly isolated in her personal life, was about to discover that winning the battle for the headlines is not the same as winning the war for survival. She had burned the bridge, blown up the foundations, and salted the earth. Now she had to live in the ruins she had created. The atmosphere leading up to the birth was thick with tension. The press camped outside her home, hungry for the next installment of the soap opera. Marina fed them scraps, keeping the narrative alive, keeping the checkbook open. But beneath the defiance, there must have been a creeping terror. She was about to become a mother, a role for which she had no model other than the one she had just publicly destroyed. She had rejected the cold mothering of Princess Alexandra, but what did she have to replace it with? She had no money, no nursery staff, no security detail. She had only Paul Mowat and the fickle affection of the British public. As the due date approached, the reality of her defection began to set in. She wasn't just a rebel anymore, she was a pariah. And pariahs historically do not fare well in the British winter. However, the theater of scandal demands a second act, and for a pregnant royal in 1990, that act could only be a wedding. The defiant isolation of her pregnancy soon gave way to the grim necessity of legitimization. As the British winter deepened, freezing the landscape into a mirror of the family's affection, The focus shifted from the headlines to the altar. But this would not be a union of joy. It would be a ceremony of containment, a desperate attempt to plaster over the cracks before the next generation arrived. The stage was set not for a celebration, but for a public capitulation disguised as a sacrament. If the public scandal of 1989 was a nuclear explosion, the wedding that followed in February 1990 was the grim radioactive fallout. In the traditional narrative of the House of Windsor, a royal wedding is the ultimate theatrical set piece, a moment of national regeneration where the monarchy displays its continuity, its wealth, and its divine blessing. We think of the cheering crowds for Charles and Diana, the carriage rides, the balcony kiss, the sea of Union Jacks. But the marriage of Marina Ogilvy to Paul Mowat at St. Andrew's Church in Ham, Surrey, was the antithesis of a fairy tale. It was a somber, frantic administrative exercise, a ceremony conducted under the heavy cloud of necessity rather than the bright sun of celebration. Marina, heavily pregnant and dressed in a gown of crushing velvet that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, walked down the aisle not as a triumphant bride, but as a woman securing a tactical alliance in a war she was already losing. The atmosphere inside the church was suffocating. The attendance of her parents, Princess Alexandra and Sir Angus Ogilvy, was the subject of feverish speculation right up until the moment their car pulled up. They came, but their presence was a masterclass in the aristocratic art of doing the absolute minimum required by duty while radiating absolute disapproval. They were there physically, but emotionally, they were light years away. Sir Angus looked as though he were attending a court-martial. Princess Alexandra, usually the beacon of royal warmth, wore a fixed, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes, a mask of endurance painted over a face of deep humiliation. They stood in the pews like statues, witnessing the union of their daughter to a man they considered a catastrophic mistake, a man who represented the breach of every social and moral code they held dear. The photographs from that day are painful to behold. They capture a family fractured beyond repair, trying to maintain the tableau of unity for the cameras while the foundations crumbled beneath their feet. It was not a wedding. It was a surrender ceremony. The tragedy of the union was that it was founded on the unstable ground of rebellion. Marina had married Paul Mowat partly because he was the father of her child, but largely because he was the anti-establishment figure she needed to validate her own identity. He was the weapon she had used to bludgeon her parents, and now she was legally bound to the weapon. As the confetti settled and the press pack moved on to the next story, the Bonnie and Clyde of the royal fringe were left alone in a rented semi-detached house, stripped of the adrenaline of the scandal and forced to confront the mundane, grinding reality of domestic life. And it was here, in the quiet desperation of suburbia, that Marina Ogilvy's real punishment began. The birth of their daughter Zanuska in May 1990 brought a momentary ceasefire. A baby, especially a first grandchild, has a way of softening even the hardest hearts. There were tentative visits, brief moments where Princess Alexandra held the infant, perhaps seeing in the child a chance for a fresh start, a generation untainted by the bitterness of the past. But a baby cannot fix a broken soul, and it certainly cannot repair a marriage built on spite. The arrival of Zanuska, and later their son Christian, in 1993 only increased the pressure on a household that was fundamentally ill-equipped to function. Marina, raised in the hushed corridors of palaces with armies of staff to attend to every need, had absolutely no concept of how to run a home. She had never been taught to cook, to clean, to budget, or to manage the chaotic logistics of raising children without help. She was a princess in a tower who had jumped out the window only to realize she didn't know how to walk on the ground. The relationship with Mowat disintegrated with frightening speed. The street smarts that had once seemed so rugged and exciting to Marina soon revealed themselves as a volatility she could not control. The clash of cultures was absolute. Marina spoke the language of the court. Mowat spoke the language of the street. What started as a passionate us against the world dynamic mutated into a toxic cycle of resentment. Mowat arguably found himself burdened with a wife who was high maintenance but stripped of her resources, a woman who expected the deference of a royal but had the bank balance of a pauper. Marina, in turn, realized that her savior was not a knight in shining armor, but a struggling photographer with a temper, a man who could not provide the lifestyle she had been bred to expect. The arguments were legendary. Neighbors reported shouting matches, the sound of breaking crockery, the police being called to the residence, a humiliating suburban cliché that was a million miles away from the silent, stiff upper lip endurance of her parents' generation. By 1997, the marriage finally imploded. The divorce was as messy and public as the courtship had been. Marina, true to form, did not go quietly. She made allegations of domestic violence, claiming Mowat had been controlling and aggressive. Mowat fired back in the press. It was a tawdry, exhausting end to a rebellion that had promised freedom but delivered only chaos. But the end of the marriage was not the end of Marina's fall. It was merely the opening of the trapdoor to the basement. Alone, with 2 young children, divorced and estranged from her family, Marina Ogilvy stared into the abyss of the British welfare system. This is the chapter of the story that is most difficult to reconcile with the glittering image of the monarchy. In the late 1990s, the Queen's cousin, the woman who had once stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, walked into a Social Security office and signed on for state benefits. It was a humiliation so profound it borders on the surreal. The British class system is built on the premise that the aristocracy are the providers, the landowners, the custodians of wealth. For a member of the blood royal to be dependent on the dole, on the charity of the taxpayers, was a subversion of the natural order. It was the ultimate failure. Marina moved into a modest rented cottage in Windsor Great Park, not far from the castle where her aunt, the Queen, held state banquets. The proximity must have been a daily torture. She could see the flag flying over the round tower, signaling the monarch's presence, while she worried about the electricity meter and the cost of school shoes. The press, sensing the grim irony, returned to the scene of the crime. The headlines changed from Rebel Princess to Pauper Princess. They photographed her looking haggard, dressed in fleece and denim, loading groceries into a battered car. They reveled in the juxtaposition, the royal blood in the welfare queue. But this time, there was less anger and more pity. She wasn't a threat anymore. She was a tragedy. She was the bag lady of the Windsor dynasty, a spectral warning of what happens when you are cut off from the life support of the firm. During these wilderness years, Marina tried desperately to find a footing. She trained in various holistic therapies, trying to reinvent herself as a healer, a masseuse, anything that would give her an identity independent of her lineage. She worked as a receptionist. She took menial jobs. There is a strange, heartbreaking nobility in this period. Stripped of her pretension, stripped of her rubber dress and her crown, she was simply a mother trying to survive. She was doing what millions of women do every day, hustling to put food on the table, but she was doing it under the crushing weight of her history. She was trying to be normal, but the world would not let her. Every employer, every colleague, every neighbor knew exactly who she was. She was the fallen one. The whispers followed her into every room. That's Princess Alexandra's daughter, they would say, the one who went mad. The silence from the royal family during this decade of destitution was deafening and absolute. It is a testament to the terrifying discipline of the House of Windsor. In any other family, if a daughter was living in poverty a few miles down the road, grandmothers or aunts would intervene. Checks would be written, groceries would be delivered. But the Windsors operate on a different frequency. To them, Marina had breached the contract. She had sold the secrets. She had embarrassed the crown. Therefore, she had to face the consequences. There was no safety net for traitors. The Queen, famed for her Christian faith and her sense of duty, did not intervene. Prince Charles, who would later speak so much about compassion and inclusivity, did not reach out. They let her sink. It was a brutal, calculated lesson in power. We are the source of all light. If you walk away from the light, you will live in the darkness. This exile was not just financial, it was existential. Marina missed the weddings, the christenings, the funerals, the ritual markers of family life that bind people together. She was erased from the narrative. When the family gathered at Sandringham for Christmas, exchanging gag gifts and walking to church, Marina was sitting in her rented cottage, likely watching them on the television news. The psychological toll of this exclusion is impossible to overstate. It reinforced the primal wound of her childhood, the belief that she was unlovable, that she was a mistake. She had tried to prove she didn't need them, and they had proven with devastating efficiency that they didn't need her. However, as the new millennium dawned, the ice began to thaw, not because of a grand apology, but because of the simple erosion of time. The rage that had fueled Marina in 1989 had burned itself out. She was tired. Her parents were aging. The sheer exhaustion of the feud began to outweigh the satisfaction of the grudge. Quietly, discreetly, without any fanfare or press releases, the lines of communication were reopened. It started with the children. Zanuska and Christian were innocent of their mother's sins, and they were, after all, Ogilvys. They were invited to family events, treated with kindness by their grandmother, Alexandra. And through the children, Marina was slowly, tentatively allowed back into the periphery. It was not a full restoration. There was no return of the prodigal daughter moment with fatted calves and celebrations. It was a conditional re-entry. She was allowed to attend the larger memorial services, the funerals where the guest list was in the hundreds. She was seen in the background, a small, quiet figure in a hat, standing rows behind the cousins she used to play with. She was no longer the royal rebel. She was the poor relation. She had been tamed. The system had won. It had starved her out, waited until her defiance was broken by the sheer difficulty of living, and then allowed her back in on its own terms as a silent, grateful ghost. In recent years, the sight of Marina Ogilvy is rare. She lives a life of profound obscurity, a stark contrast to the global fame she briefly courted. She resides in a small cottage on the Windsor estate, a final mercy from the family, perhaps, ensuring she has a roof over her head, but a roof that belongs to them. She is a tenant of her heritage, not an owner. Her children have grown into impressive, well-adjusted adults, navigating the social scene with a grace their mother struggled to find, perhaps proving that the trauma ends with her. But Marina herself remains a figure of pathos. She is the woman who flew too close to the sun of celebrity, melted her wax wings and fell into the sea, only to be washed up on a lonely beach, alive but forever scarred. Her story serves as the dark mirror to the modern royal dramas. When we watch Prince Harry and Meghan Markle navigate their exit, when we see the interviews and the books, we are watching a high-gloss, well-funded version of the path Marina hacked through the jungle with a machete 30 years ago. But Marina didn't have Netflix. She didn't have a global brand. She only had her anger and a tabloid press that chewed her up and spat her out. She proved that you can leave the royal family, but you cannot escape it. The firm is not just an institution, it is a gravity well. You can orbit it, you can crash into it, but you can never truly leave its pull. As we reach the end of this autopsy of a royal life, we are left with a haunting image. It is not the image of the rubber dress or the tearful face on Wogan. It is the image of a woman in her late 50s, walking alone in Windsor Great Park, staring at the castle walls that were once her playground, and then her prison. She is the only woman in history who tried to destroy the House of Windsor from the inside out, and discovered that the house was made of stone and she was made of glass. The stone remains, weathered but standing. The glass is shattered, the pieces swept into the corners of history, catching the light only when someone bothers to look down. This shattering was not the end of her existence, but it was the end of her relevance, a far crueler fate in the eyes of the public. As the shards of her rebellion were swept away by the relentless broom of time, the world began to turn its attention to new faces and fresh scandals. The shattered glass of Marina's life lay undisturbed on the ground, slowly covered by the falling leaves of passing years, until she became something the monarchy values, even less than a rebel, a relic. The turn of the millennium would bring a new era of royal celebrity, leaving Marina Ogilvy stranded on the wrong side of history, a ghost haunting the edges of a kingdom that had long since learned to look right through her. As the 21st century accelerated, leaving the analog scandals of the 1980s in the dustbin of history, Marina Ogilvy quietly faded into the background noise of British life. The relentless flashbulbs that had once documented her every misstep turned their gaze toward new, fresher dramas. The death of Princess Diana, the coming of age of William and Harry, the endless soap opera of the modernized monarchy. Marina became a living anachronism, a character from a canceled spin-off show that nobody watched anymore. She slipped into a life of aggressive ordinariness, living in the shadow of Windsor Castle not as a princess, but as a ghost. The ultimate victory of the House of Windsor was not that they destroyed her, but that they rendered her irrelevant. They stripped her of the one thing she had craved since childhood, significance. By refusing to fight her, by refusing to acknowledge her rubber-clad rebellion, they allowed her to dissolve into the beige tapestry of suburban England, proving that without the reflected light of the crown, a royal rebel is just a woman with a posh accent and a pile of debts. Yet to view Marina merely as a failed footnote is to miss the profound historical significance of her tragedy. In retrospect, Marina Ogilvy was the patient zero of the modern royal crisis. She was the beta test for Megxit, occurring 30 years before Prince Harry and Meghan Markle ever sat down with Oprah Winfrey. Every beat of the Sussexes' explosive departure was prefigured in Marina's chaotic exit. The accusation of emotional coldness, the feeling of being trapped in a zoo, the weaponization of the media to tell my truth, the desire to be financially independent while still capitalizing on the royal name. Marina did it all first, but she did it in an era that was not ready for her. She lacked the sophisticated PR machinery of Hollywood. She lacked the language of mental health awareness that protects modern celebrities. And crucially, she lacked the money to sustain a war of attrition. Harry and Meghan had millions. Marina had a check from Today newspaper that barely covered a year's rent. Her failure was a failure of resources and timing, not of intent. She showed the world that a royal could defect, but she also showed the terrifying cost of doing so without a safety net. The stark difference in how Marina's rebellion is remembered compared to later royal exits exposes the brutal misogyny and classism inherent in the system. When Prince Harry wrote Spare, detailing physical altercations and emotional neglect, it was a global publishing phenomenon, debated by intellectuals and historians. When Marina went on Wogan to cry about her parents' cruelty, she was dismissed as a hysterical girl, a wild child, a slapper in a rubber dress. Her trauma was delegitimized because it was messy, because it was low rent, and because she was a woman who dared to be sexual and difficult in public. The establishment labeled her mad so they wouldn't have to admit she might be sad. It is a tactic the firm has used for centuries. Pathologize the dissenter so you don't have to address the dissent. By framing Marina as the unstable, ungrateful daughter, Princess Alexandra and the Queen were absolved of any responsibility to examine the cold, suffocating environment that had produced her. There is a profound irony in the legacy of her children, Zanuska and Christian. In a twist that perhaps only a novelist could script, the children born of that disastrous, scandal-plagued union have grown up to be model citizens of the royal fringe. Zanuska Mowat is frequently photographed on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, standing shoulder to shoulder with the very family that once wanted to abort her existence. She works in luxury fashion. She attends the garden parties. She smiles the perfect Windsor smile. She is the suitable woman her mother refused to be. This acceptance of the children is the final bittersweet twist of the knife for Marina. It proves that the institution's issue was never really with the illegitimacy or the bloodline. It was with control. The children are accepted because they play the game. They abide by the code of silence. They validate the system. Marina remains on the outside not because of what she did 30 years ago, but because she is the living reminder of the system's failure to control its own. She is the cracked mirror they don't want to look into. Today, the relationship between Marina and her mother, Princess Alexandra, has settled into a fragile autumnal peace. As Alexandra approaches her 90s, frail and revered as the last great lady of the old school, the fire of the feud has turned to ash. There are visits. There is civility. But one wonders what is said in the quiet moments between them. Can there ever be true intimacy between a mother who chose duty over her daughter and a daughter who sold her mother for cash? The scar tissue of 1989 is too thick, too colloidal to ever truly heal. They are two women stranded on opposite sides of a philosophical canyon. One who believes that the self must be sacrificed for the greater good of the crown, and one who believed that the self was the only thing worth saving. Neither truly won. Alexandra kept her reputation but lost her daughter's heart. Marina kept her pride but lost her place in the world. As we conduct this autopsy of a dynastic sacrifice, we must ask what Marina Ogilvy's life actually meant. Was she a pioneer or a cautionary tale? In truth, she was the canary in the coal mine. She suffocated so that later generations could learn how to breathe, or at least how to bring their own oxygen masks. She exposed the fragility of the royal fairy tale long before the internet tore it to shreds. She showed that beneath the ermine and the velvet, the royal family is capable of a ruthlessness that would make a corporate boardroom look like a nursery. They are in the business of survival, and business is good. When Marina threatened the brand crushed her. It didn't scream, it didn't fight, it just closed the heavy oak doors and let the English winter do the rest. The final image of Marina Ogilvy is not the defiant punk in the rubber dress, nor the weeping victim on the sofa. It is the image of a woman in her late 50s, walking through the park in Windsor, a solitary figure against the gray sky. She carries the blood of Queen Victoria, the cousinship of the Queen, and the memories of a life lived in the epicenter of a cultural hurricane. But to the passers-by, she is nobody. She is the woman who tried to outrun her shadow, only to find that you cannot outrun your blood. She is the spare who was thrown away, the piece of the puzzle that didn't fit and was swept under the rug. In the end, the House of Windsor is a theater, and Marina Ogilvy committed the one sin for which there is no forgiveness. She stopped acting, walked to the front of the stage, and turned on the house lights, revealing the dust, the wires, and the empty seats in the dark. And for that moment of blinding, inconvenient truth, she was sentenced to a lifetime of silence.